Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Kyle Naranya, and welcome to episode 148. And on this week's episode of the podcast, I am going to be reviewing From the World from John Wick, Ballerina, or Ballerina. I understand we're doing this fast saga. I mean, there's been other ones, and I honestly can't think of any of them off the top of my head. But the first official spinoff in the world of John Wick, as it's obviously in the title, will be reviewed this week. There will be a non-spoiler review and a spoiler review. No need to worry, time codes will be listed in the description so you can hear my non-spoiler thoughts, and then maybe once you've seen it, you can hear what I have to say about all the plot twists and whatnot. Or maybe you just like listening to the whole thing. No judgment. However you want to listen to the review is good with me. And then to round out the episode, I will be responding to my listener mail and question of the week responses. Let's jump into more Ballerina? Ana de Armas?
You will always be weaker. You will always be smaller. You want to win? Improvise. Adapt. Cheat.
Now, first off, I probably know what you're thinking, which is, Kyle, we've already had a continuation of the John Wick universe. And technically, we're both right, which is the Continental From the World of John Wick, of course, was a television series that ran for 3 episodes. But what's really fascinating about that is none of the people involved with John Wick, outside of, I believe, a producer, were connected to that whatsoever. There was no writer. There was no direction from Chad Stahelski, Derek Kolstad, or Shay Hayton, who worked on, or Hatton, I'm not actually sure how to pronounce that, the later 2 films. Ballerina is a movie that was picked up back in 2017, which is really interesting, particularly of where it sets in the timeline. That's not a good sentence whatsoever. Its place in the John Wick timeline is a part of the marketing, which is obviously seeing John Wick in it. It takes place between Chapter 3, Parabellum, and Chapter 4, which as of now is the final chapter, which is why we can see Keanu Reeves in the marketing material. But the production to this took quite a while to where it finally was announced back in 2022 and then ultimately released now, June 6th of 2025. It's really funny to see how this sort of thing has cobbled itself together, which was at the time of its announcement, Ana de Armas was in No Time to Die. She was in Knives Out, not in that order, and has become an absolute superstar, leading a substantial amount of properties. She's already done a Marilyn Monroe film. She has done Ghosted, which is not something necessarily to be overly over the moon with, but then also The Gray Man. Multiple projects with Chris Evans. And now she is the titular character in a John Wick spinoff, the first official continuation of the universe. And it's funny to me to have it now, particularly because there's a debate amongst fans as to whether John Wick 5 is a good idea. The studio, of course, would love for them to make another one because when it comes to a box office release standpoint, each John Wick has made more money. And they believe, as a lot of people would assume, that a John Wick 5 would make even more money. I don't know if that's necessarily the case. Now, I have a lot of faith in Chad Stahelski as an individual director. He's worked on a lot of incredible projects, and he's going to be working on a Highlander film coming up. But John Wick 4 is easily one of the best action movies of the 21st century. And if you've seen it, spoilers, John Wick dies. And it actually has a compelling conclusion, which at times was definitely a bumpy road throughout that universe. So getting a continuation of that universe that's technically also a prequel to its conclusion of the John Wick part of it is awesome because we get to see this world we really love through new eyes with Ballerina. I'm not going to call it From the World of John Wick Ballerina. That's ridiculously obnoxious. Ana de Armas' character of Eve is really compelling. Her story is very similar and obviously connected to John Wick's, but also so much of it is not told in the way that we know how John Wick's backstory has been fleshed out through the 4 films that I can get more into in spoilers. But a female-led action film, there's been conversations about the box office success of female-led films, which is ridiculous. There's been a substantial amount of unsuccessful films in this category, which is significantly disappointing given the lack of female lead films in this genre. But what's so funny to me is, and I'm glad I meant to record the other day, and I'm glad I waited to record till today, because I kept thinking about Atomic Blonde, which of course was made by David Leitch, one of the co-directors of John Wick, it being adapted from a graphic novel, but it felt so interesting and similar enough to the world of John Wick that people talked about the possibility of there being a connection between those two franchises. And unfortunately, a sequel to that's been kind of stalled, which is super disappointing because Charlize Theron's she's made 2 Old Guard movies since then, and I would much rather see something established in the John Wick universe. And that's what works so well for this film. I like Len Wiseman as a director. Shay Hatton as a writer really seems to understand the mythology and what works best about this world and his exploration of it, where you don't have to establish any new identities for the characters in terms of where everybody fits, certainly where they are put amongst the pecking order. We know all of the different organizations, or do we? I'll get more into that in spoilers. And we get to see it through new eyes. In the trailers, you see bits of Eve's origin story, and the way that that's presented is certainly way different than John Wick's, and it gives us an eye into this world where a fish out of water situation, which is not abnormal for an origin story, which this mostly does function as, but it allows us a way different perspective than you get with John Wick. I like differences in that realm, because if you gave us a trained veteran similar to John Wick, you do wind up having some comparisons as to, well, you just gave us a female John Wick. But having a different characterization of your main character, how they fit in that universe, allows it to feel even more unique than the previous 4 installments in this universe, where she's not this trained pro, the Baba Yaga, which John Wick is, which is the whole mystique about him in the first film is it's this guy, this monster, the Baba Yaga, the boogeyman, coming out of retirement. Eve's interesting because you are learning and exploring the universe through somebody who doesn't know and isn't a trained pro. That makes it instantly more compelling because as the viewer, we understand what she's going to and where the worlds are, visiting the different hotels, what the rules are, how that works, the high table, and all of the lore that's been established over 9 hours probably at this point of the John Wick universe. And different boots on the ground make it so it doesn't feel like a substantial rehash of what we've got before, which I do really appreciate. I know one thing people are going to be asking about is how is the action. It is incredible. There is something to be said for the setup for this movie instantly throws you into this world and reminds you of all of the dovetail parts that make it work so efficiently. What 8711 has done as a production studio and its focus on practical action has created an entire new genre within the action genre in filmmaking, which is taking your lead, putting them through their paces, designing choreography so that it best suits what their skill set is, as opposed to, we previs this 6 months ago, let's see if we can get you in it, maybe it'll work, maybe it'll not. And it allows the commitment of the actor to best suit the storytelling and allow the practicality of the action to feel much more realistic because we are witnessing that actor do incredible things. Still some of the fantastical elements of what the body can be put through, whether that's John Wick falling off of the Continental at the end of John Wick 3, but it allows us to really feel those hits and be engaged in the action sequences. And that's really important in a movie like this. You can have insane spectacle, but at the same time, it needs to be grounded in some form of reality. And Ballerina does that. For the most part, I really enjoyed the movie. It's just over 2 hours, which is perfect for this kind of movie, especially when you're introducing an entirely new character to sort of wedge into this time frame that we have between John Wick 3 and 4. I find it incredibly interesting because I did rewatch 3 and 4 before going to see Ballerina. And I know there's a time jump given having seen both of those movies, but thanks to our friends at Screen Rant, they did they did write an article that says we have a 6-month gap between those two movies. And the main crux of this story fits right in there, which, as I said in the very beginning, allows us to have Keanu in this because he's not a ghost or a Force ghost, although a Jedi Force ghost Keanu Reeves is something I definitely feel like we need to see. And I like that. I enjoy the movie. The overall crux of the story is not wildly complicated, and that's not one of the things that John Wick did. It has a crazy lore and backstory to how its world works, and we got to see sort of the layers peeled. Oh my goodness. The layers peeled back as we continually made more installments in the main John Wick franchise. So having all of those things set up allows for Eve to explore familiar territory, but also, and I put this in the sound clip, this is incredibly important to characterize that she is a woman in this world, and the way that she's going to be a successful assassin and fighter are substantially different to the brute force tactics to some degree that we've seen from a lot of our male leads within the John Wick universe. And this is something that I appreciate is similar to what I loved about the Atomic Blonde film, which is, yeah, there's going to be instances where she is the smaller person, and how is she going to overcome those obstacles when you, quite frankly, just don't have the same density of muscle or weight to put behind your punches or your flips or your kicks because she's just a smaller person. And I like that. I think Ana de Armas really invested her time and effort into this role. It's unlike anything we've seen from her before. If you're thinking of No Time to Die as I say that, No Time to Die, that character of Tequila, is way over her head. Now, she's incredibly talented, but the difference between her and Eve is the purpose to which Eve is doing all these things, the feeling of, actually, I don't think I want to say that, but the drive that she has to do what she does in this is not of obligation to a mission or a job. It's personal. And because of that, we get an entirely different kind of Ana de Armas within action. There's a lot of similarities in the way that she plays with guns, or the gunplay to which she participates in, but that character's mentality in those sequences is significantly different, and I appreciate that because what sold her to me in the first, or in No Time to Die, and why I thought she would absolutely crush the role of Ballerina, is because of what we saw from her in that James Bond appearance, for however brief that it was. The supporting cast in the movie is okay. I don't think Norman Reedus needed to be in here. It's cool. I loved Boondock Saints, and of course I almost forgot the name of his character. What is his name? Daryl. Oh my goodness. I haven't watched The Walking Dead in probably a decade. That's why I was unable to forget it. But to get to see Lance Reddick and Ian McShane back in the Continental was amazing. I love their dynamic between each other, and getting to see Winston's relationship with somebody different than John, or Jonathan as he would call him, was really compelling, just to see a much more fatherly figure from him as opposed to the maybe younger brother but son, and the way that they are treated slightly differently. Not in terms of one better than the other, that's the last thing I would want you to think, but his relationship with Eve is so different than the one that he's had with John Wick in particular, and the way that everybody feels about what is happening with Eve throughout the film and the politics of this world continually managed to be interesting, and because of that, this movie's a lot of fun. Now, I think because they didn't believe maybe there was going to be another one, there's a lot of story in this. Some of the elements introduced aren't necessarily super delved into, and that's okay, because the selling of this is, do you care about the character in the action sequences that are going to be absolutely spectacular? And there's a lot of familiar elements to this, but as I said, they are perfectly fitted to what Ana is capable of, and she excels dramatically in the different action sequences, as well as using, I'm sure you would have to for safety purposes, as well as technical prowess with the ballerina and the dance sequences. There's a lot of 8711 familiar stuntmen in this movie, which I appreciate, and I recognize their faces every time I see them, but I really enjoyed this movie. I thought it was incredibly fun. If you are a fan of the John Wick franchise, this is definitely worth your time. Highly recommend checking it out. Now, I can jump into spoilers and give you all the nitty-gritty, the plots, twists, and all of those fun things. So let's jump into spoilers now from the world of John Wick, Ballerina.
You're him. The one they call the Baba Yaga. How do I start doing what you do?
Looks like you already have.
We are now in full spoilers for From the World of John Wick Ballerina or John Wick Ballerina, whatever you want to Google, it comes up regardless. You have been warned, spoilers ahead. So I mentioned in non-spoilers that this movie functions as an origin story, and I appreciate that. It doesn't make it as interesting when you just sort of drop a new character to us in the world. Now we are gonna maybe get a spinoff with Kane, who was played by, I want to say Donnie Yen, but my brain is telling me that's wrong, which is very weird because it is obviously Donnie Yen in John Wick 4. And I'm really looking forward to that, but that's a character who we already know. What's so fun about Ballerina is we're aware of the Ballerina school and the Ruska Roma, which is the family we are aware of from the previous franchise. We know where John Wick is from. His ticket gets ripped. And that's kind of the kicking off point and the connection that we have to this movie, which I really dug. One of my favorite things is this movie opens up with an action sequence where we get to see Eve's dad really kick ass. And it is David Castellaneta would be my guess. And for if I mispronounce that, apologies. And people would be familiar with him because he is Diego Hargreaves from Umbrella Academy. He looks like Diego because it is Diego, and selling us that she comes from this lineage of people who are very capable as a result of the setup of the villain, which is the Chancellor, which is this cult of people where they produce assassins, but you never get to leave. The children have to stay there. And having a tribe within the world of John Wick that we're unfamiliar with and automatically setting them up as villains against parts of the organization that we know already makes for a compelling villain, which I really did appreciate. So opening on an action sequence with a brand new character, having them die because of the main villain of the story sets the stakes for where we go from the rest of the movie. And this gives our main character, Eve, the motivation and the drive to do what she's supposed to be doing the whole movie. And I appreciate that. It's not something that happens halfway through the movie where there's a turn or her friend dies, which would not necessarily be shocking, and it's significantly conventional, but killing off a parent in the beginning, showing that it's not necessarily a family connection, although her father is one of the Ruska Roma. It's Winston who brings her in, and seeing where she is and that drive that she has to become the best. And as I played in the clip, she is somebody of smaller stature that's going to struggle in aspects that the men within the Ruska Roma aren't going to have to struggle. And getting to see her progression, that she's not this perfect fighter. I like from a hero where we get to see some of their flaws. One of my favorite elements of the John Wick franchise, and this continues in this film, is the amount of glass, windows, panels, doors our main characters get thrown through, where they would be absolutely shredded like John McClane's feet in Die Hard 1. That continues, but because she is a relative rookie, although she graduates from the Ruska Roma, which is something we haven't necessarily seen before, and that's what I love about this universe. Each movie has given us a different piece of the lore to establish what all of the rules are, what's the dynamics of all of these different positions within the John Wick assassin universe, and getting to see somebody actually go through assassin school / ballerina school was really interesting. Getting to see somebody graduate, what they have to do is ultimately kill somebody who hasn't graduated, and that sets her on her path. Ultimately coming into crosshairs with a dead cultist who was responsible or connected to the main bad guy, who is called the Chancellor, who runs this cult of assassins over in Hallstatt, which I believe is in Austria. And what's really funny is because these organizations are so old that she cannot and is not allowed to pursue any act of aggression towards that cult because they sort of have a you leave us alone, we leave you alone, even though we both function under the high table. The high table is still the main governing body of this whole thing, as they would be. And the fact that she's so driven with rage because of what happened to her father, not knowing what happened to her mother, is what motivates her to do what she does, which is she doesn't care about that ultimate choice, and she decides to continually progress and move forward with this mission of finding the Chancellor, who she doesn't know at this time, but still managing to capture all of the staples that we love from this movie. And 8711, my God, they're so clever, because John Wick has had some incredible action sequences, and Ballerina maintains that by being not derivative of what we've seen before. There's a moment in the trailers that I thought was absolutely insane, but is only a microcosm of one fight sequence, which is where we always have the moment in the John Wick films where they got to go meet up with I think they're sommeliers normally, but I can't remember specifically who the person is she visits, but he's got all the guns. So she visits this guy, and because the cultists are onto the fact that somebody has killed one of their own, they're after her, and they attack and infiltrate this building. And Eve doesn't manage to get an actual firearm in this instance. She kills everybody in this gun vault building with grenades. And the creativity in which she is able to use them, still protect herself. It's a great moment in the trailer where Eve uses a blast-proof door to protect herself, or a table, which I don't know what that table's made out of, but it was absolutely insane. And maintaining that level of insanity. Having a unique weapon is something we love from John Wick. It's through all 4 films he killed a man with a pencil. And in this movie, we get a samurai sword, which we've seen elements from before, but it's Eve through the remnants of this fight later on. She also uses figure skates, which was insane. And then, of course, we get what I dubbed, and is absolutely incredible, and they're in the movie way more than you'd suspect, but there is a flamethrower versus a firefighter hose, and that sequence is absolutely insane. It is just straight up 2 Digimon or 2 Pokemon going at it. Water versus fire. We all played Pokemon Red and Blue. Maybe you didn't. You could be much younger than me. I don't know. That makes me feel really old having said that. But that fight sequence is incredible, and it builds to that. It's not, let's just bring in this thing and make it really cool. We show the progression of this character where, because Eve is not the trained veteran, she's struggling through some of these, like just getting through these fights by the skin of her teeth. But seeing that how she problem solves her way out of it is really interesting, because she does have to tackle, quite literally sometimes, these fight scenes way differently than the other people would have to. And I like that from them. I mentioned Norman Reedus earlier. He is the father of one of the cultists' children, and that's her first mission, to kind of find out necessarily where they could be hanging out. And I like Norman Reedus, but he's in the movie for one action sequence and then kind of gets pushed to the side, which is a little disappointing given his prowess in stuff like Boondock Saints. And he said himself the fight scenes as Daryl were not choreographed nearly with the same level of precision, but he's a character I would hope we get to see more from later on. One of the elements of the story that I think was completely unnecessary and could have been really interesting, maybe moving into a sequel, is that we learn that Eve's sister is still alive and actually living with the cultists, which could have been a really cool thing to explore in a sequel. Absolutely, after the death of the Chancellor, because, spoilers, he does ultimately get killed. But she's introduced, and they believed each other was dead, but it doesn't wind up going anywhere. So I don't necessarily know why they chose to introduce that part of the story in this film. That could have been maybe what progressed us into the sequel, which I hope that this does get. It was funny. I saw this with a friend of mine, and he asked what they thought the budget for this would be. And I said this has to be in the $80 to $90 million range, because you don't want to blow this budget out where if it's a mild hit, it's still successful. And fortunately, the movie is $80 to $90 million, which is, it didn't absolutely destroy the box office. I believe it is going to win the weekend. I hope so. I'm not necessarily sure. Let's look that up, because I don't know if it is going to. It does not look like it's going to. It looks like Lilo and Stitch is going to still maintain that. It did open at second with a domestic gross of 25 million and an additional 26 internationally. So a moderate hit, it might just barely break even. So if you're looking for more John Wick in the world of John Wick, this is worth checking out. And I'll wrap this up by saying the integration of John Wick is interesting. We get to see him when he goes to get his ticket ripped or his cross branded, essentially as a get out of jail free card with the Ruska Roma, so he can escape the city and go pursue the man who sits above the table. And in that 2-month gap, while Eve is becoming a more successful assassin, when she's doing this mission, what's funny is John is then hired to stop her from fighting against the cult because they have that agreement, which is interesting because I don't know how that fits in the gap where we know that John is horribly injured by falling off of a roof in the Continental, and it's supposed to be a 6-month gap. So 2 months into hiding with the Bowery King, I guess he decided to work with the Ruska Roma because they did him that favor. It's that part of it doesn't necessarily work out if you're not thinking about it too heavily, but overall, it's cool to see that John Wick is still John Wick. There is a fight between him and Eve, and he's the Baba Yaga. Of course, he wins that, but they connect on a human level where she tells him what the Chancellor has done to them, and he sees she's not going to give up, and she is one of his own. Not literally, but she is a Ruska Roma, and he sees that if she's not going to give up, and I would do the same. Look what I've been doing for the last 3 movies, and I like that level of connection, reminding us of the humanity that is within the Baba Yaga. John Wick has that. This whole thing set off because of somebody killing his dog after the death of his wife. And then, of course, the snowball rolled down the hill after that. So I really dug Ballerina. I think it's a wildly entertaining action movie that scratches the itch of the John Wick universe. And I would much rather them make successful spin-offs than John Wick 5. Please don't make John Wick 5. John Wick 4 had such a great ending. You're just going to ruin it, even though it looks like you're probably going to make that movie anyways. So those are my final thoughts on From the World of John Wick, Ballerina. Let's jump into Listener of the Mail and Question of the Week responses.
Can I ask you a question? Just fun?
There's something I've been meaning to ask you.
I ask the questions, you answer the questions.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Did that count as a question?
Yes.
Damn it.
If you would like to answer the question of the week, you can email the podcast, filmreelistspod@gmail.com, or you can answer directly below on Spotify or YouTube. Or lastly, you can comment directly on the question of the week social media post, which usually goes up on Thursday. This week's question of the week was, what action franchise do you think needs a ballerina-style spinoff? Here are the answers. Jermaine Jones, you aren't at a hibachi, Kyle, but watch me cook. You have a young indie-type movie, but with current Lucy Liu narrating the chronicles of Oren Ishii, and it's about her days from watching her parents get killed to becoming one of the world's best assassins to be the head of the Yakuza. Now, for those who don't know, Oren Ishii is Lucy Liu's character in Kill Bill. That could be really interesting. You kind of lost me with the young indie because the young Indiana Jones Chronicles, Jermaine, are edutainment. I think that would be really awesome, though, just to see more of the world. That is really interesting, and I love Lucy Liu, and it would hopefully give an opportunity to an unknown Asian actress, so that would be really cool. Cinema Spools writes in, the trick with this is there a supporting character that could be the lead of their own movie? Given all of that, I would say maybe an M origin story. That's really interesting. Which M? I would love a Judi Dench M movie, but obviously, if they're going to do that because Amazon now owns the rights, it's whoever is the M in the new version of these films that they're making. By the way, Amazon, you're taking way too long to make a new James Bond movie. Just saying. Scotty Cameron, Kyle's question. Maybe the current Mission Impossible series with a spinoff featuring Jim Phelps Jr. as a nod to the show. That would be cool. Maybe more akin to the show being about the mystery and the spy work than the giant stunts that we've gotten more recently. Granted, I prefer Final Reckoning to be a conclusion. Yeah, me too. I wish it was one. Alternative answer, the Extraction series. I'm not sure what would be a good spin-off, but then again, Ballerina never appeared in the John Wick films. Yes, this is true. Dylan's question. Push was a film that had great concepts like superhuman classifications, but the execution left some to be desired. Legacy Odinson. Hello. I'm looking forward to Ballerina this weekend, but admittedly, I'm hard-pressed to think of another series I would want a spin-off for. Granted, I'm usually hesitant towards spin-offs as is. Maybe when Nobody 2 comes out this year, I'll have a different perspective on that particular question. But we'll get there when we get there. Totally fair, Legacy. Thanks for your answer. Dylan writes in, I could see them doing a spin-off of Reacher with Neely, but I think everything that could have a spin-off does because capitalism. What's something that has a spin-off you wish didn't? While answering Dylan's question, which I did do, Neely is getting a spin-off. They're currently shooting that right now. What's something has a spin-off that you wish didn't? Given all of the politics amongst the Fast and Furious franchise, I think it was a mistake to do what they did with Hobbs and Shaw because it introduces a new Shaw character, but didn't even have Owen in the movie, and we're essentially going to be dropping all of that stuff moving forward because the next movie is going to be a Hobbs and Reyes movie. So that's the one that I would get rid of. Now, to this week's question of the week. Next week's episode of the podcast is going to be a review of How to Train Your Dragon. Now, I know this is going to be controversial because we are so tired of these live action films, but instead, I'm going to pivot to something entirely different, which is the question of the week for next week's episode of the podcast is, what is your favorite movie with dragons? It's so open, it's so broad, there's a ton of different things, so I look forward to the answers. I've already told you how you can submit your answer, but I will tell you again. You can email the podcast at filmreelistspod@gmail.com, or you can answer directly on Spotify and YouTube. Lastly, you can comment on the question of the week social media post that goes up on Thursday. Just make sure you are following Film Realist on your preferred social media platform. That will do it for this week's episode of the podcast. Previously stated, but I will say it again. Next week's episode will be a review of the live-action remake of How to Train Your Dragon. If you haven't yet, please follow the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Leave a 5-star review. If you leave a written one, I will read it on the show. The podcast is getting more every day, and I am so grateful to everybody who chooses to be a film realist with me. My name is Kyle Naranya, and I will see you next time.